I am recording.
And we are live. Welcome to Against the Narrative, guys. We're back here again for another conversation. I think we're just going over really valuing yourself and finding yourself and a lot of the concepts around self today. I'd like to really just kind of start off with the point of understanding, like, the biggest thing would be about self work and self love is understanding that you need to know who you are before you try to do this work. A lot of times we get caught up in this idea of what other people's idea of balance, idea of self is, and it doesn't allow us to find practices that work for us individually. And that's where I would kind of like to start off. And I'm gonna let Solo give his intro and let us know where he's at with it.
Appreciate it. No, I definitely agree with that. Part of my mind likes to begin with definitions. Asking the question, "What is the self? Who are you? What are we?" But Carl Jung was a famous psychologist, and he thought of the self as essentially the totality of your being, which is very interesting. He split your psyche, up into different complexes such as the ego, the persona, the anima slash animus, and then a connection to the collective unconscious, as well as the shadow. And he thought of the self as a gestalt, which means that it's a pattern that is more than the sum of its parts. It's like you are a collection of different elements, different subpersonalities, emotions, thoughts, complexes, and the self, he often wrote it with a capital S, self, was the totality of all of those things that I suppose it's similar to music where you have different instruments and elements that when you listen to them individually do not make the same sound compared to when you form them together in a whole and listen to it synchronously. So I'm running with that definition moving forward. And then when I think about how to understand yourself, I will just start with the idea that you are both being and becoming. And I came across these terms initially with Jordan Peterson, but just recently read a book called Existence by Rollo May and a few others, and it's an introductory text into existentialist philosophy and also existentialist psychiatry. And they talk about being and becoming aligned. So you can imagine being as, in some sense, your present experience, your thoughts about yourself right now, but in another sense, whenever you try to attend to yourself or to be present, that's already fleeting. And so we are caught in this experience of essentially always leaning forward into time where it's hard to get a snapshot of who you are now, but it's more reasonable to imagine your personality as something unfolding across time into the future, and not necessarily randomly either. Your personality is unfolding towards certain goals. And so I'll pause there with the idea that you can conceptualize yourself as being and becoming towards different goals.
I like that stopping point because for me, it speaks to what really brought me into the self work and things of that nature. Because Taoism is really what set me down. Trying to understand what Wu Wei meant took me down a rabbit hole. Because how can I be actionless without moving? Well, then you realize, okay, well, technically, if I sit still, my body doesn't stop. There are a lot of functions internally that keep going. Most importantly, thoughts. And so analyzing thoughts and emotions brought me to a different and interesting place with self work. And what it did was it allowed for me to view myself as being, like you said, a whole of multiple parts. Each thought, each emotion is a different character that I can embody. Anger, happiness, sadness are different phases of myself. I call the word I use now in the terminology I use now is lenses. So like every perception you have of yourself is a lens from which you view reality. So if I attach to me understanding myself to be Demonte from Atlanta that dances, there's a certain way that he views the world. But the freedom that here is that I can remove all of those layers and observe them. Like that's not the actuality of who I am because there's a whole wholeness to it. I have multiple different names, first, last, middle name, different ways that I can choose to attach to the self that would allow me to be more fluid. And eventually, what it did is it allowed for me to kind of sit in the center of this emanation that is me and not attached to any one side of it. I believe we spoke about this on the last time where it's like I have multiple different names. People call me different things. And I'm okay with that because I understand that that's them identifying either an aspect of myself that I've already attached to or an aspect of myself that they're observing that I'm unaware of. And my ability to be open to how other people view me would allow me to see other aspects of myself that I may ignore. And I think that's something that's deep about self-work, is really asking yourself, are you aware of the range of emotions and thoughts that you have? And are you accountable for all of them? Are there some that you ignore or that you disassociate with because they're not always the most, they don't bring the best results in life? So you don't like I don't do that because the one time I did that, this happened. Well, you still did it and it's a part of you. So denying it kind of pushes you in a weird place. And so I think that's a big thing.
Picking up on that last point of, I guess, awareness of behavior, there is this other psychologist named Harry Stack Sullivan, and he liked to conceptualize personality solely in terms of social relationships. And so you mentioned the lenses that, let's say, revolve around a core of who you are. The thought that came to my mind was those lenses being other people's perception of you and your capacity to, let's say, lean into or away from those lenses. And so Harry Stack Sullivan came after Freud, who, of course, in some sense popularized the idea of the ego. Harry Stack Sullivan essentially, I might get this wrong, didn't believe too much in an ego. He thought you were nothing but your social relationships, which is an interesting argument because there is so much information that you don't have about yourself that other people do have about you, and they see your habits, your mannerisms, your facial twitches, all of these things that are unconscious to you. And so there is something to be said about how much of you is really embedded in the perceptions of others. Now, I disagree with the amount of de-emphasis that Sullivan places on the ego. I still think that there's a you there that is trying to attend to all of these things, but I bring him up just to highlight the social aspect of what makes you you. And then a second point that I would bring up, one helpful dimension of understanding yourself is just your relationship to your own unconscious, like you're mentioning. Many people I have observed operate as if their ego is all that they are. And when I say ego, I just mean your seat of awareness. When you're in the car driving and you're talking to yourself, or when you notice something and you think in words or images to yourself, that's your ego. Many people think that's all there is to them. And there's so much more to them that's in potential, that's in actuality. And I really like the way that Jung characterized the relationship between the ego and the self. He thought that the self was the source that the source of maybe unlimited potential and information, the one of the primary archetypes that is associated with the collective unconscious that helps guide the ego and make helps expand conscious awareness of the ego, let's say that. And so, yeah, people, a lot of who people are can be understood in terms of social relationships. And then also, one useful mechanism of trying to better understand who you are is to just realize that there's way more to you than you usually think about.
And I think one big thing for me was like really rationalizing this, like, okay, so we talk about the self and the ego. What made this hit home for me was thinking about, okay, if I'm born into this world, before they give me a name, how do I identify myself? And do I still exist? Yes, I'm born. I exist before someone gives me a name. And outside of that, I have my own habits usually that are coming through epigenetics or something in some form or fashion. How I react, how I move, how I interact with the world around me, even without that name or that understanding or that level of social interaction. Um, is the root version of me. Like, so this is why the whole inner child work in metaphysics and spiritual communities is such a big thing, because there's an aspect of yourself that is untouched by society. And that is technically your true self. That's how you initially felt about the things that you experienced in this world. And through interacting with the world, you're conditioned to either understand these things as what people would tell you they are, or you come up with your own understandings. And whether or not you share that and how you interact in between that, I believe is an interesting space, because when you talk about like the public, private, and secret version of yourself, a lot of people publicly are in one way, privately are another way. And like you said, internal monologue, totally different person. So in that aspect, it's like socially, I'm only showing you the side that I'm most proud of. I'm showing you the side that I want people to see. And then privately, I'm telling people usually how I truly feel. Some people's public and private faces are totally different. Some of them are very intertwined. Like me, I try to have the same opinions publicly as I do privately. And secretly, I have things that I don't talk about because I just don't know how to even like communicate the experience honestly, or just don't know if people would believe it. And so you got to think about how many things that people have been through or experiences that they never talk about, things that they see, things that they think about, visions. It's a lot of things that happen that people don't talk about. And so that version of self, I don't believe that socially just shows you how you show up to others. And then you have a personal perception of what you are personally. And so when you get into shadow work, it's really about understanding how much of you do you ignore or do you deny. And so in order to get a holistic view of yourself, you have to start looking at all those things that you aren't happy about, are aspects of yourself. And in order to do that, you have to put yourself in positions that are uncomfortable for them things to arise again. And I think that's the biggest thing about self work, is like, are you really putting yourself in position to change? And I'll kind of cut it there.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And one version of psychology that I'm most interested in is personality psychology. And one, I guess, axiom of personality psychology is that many of the different ways that we can describe individuals are normally distributed, meaning that you just mentioned, for example, the willingness to put yourself in an uncomfortable position. There are some people who are really willing to do that and some people who aren't willing to do that. And then there's an
At
average in
all.
the middle, right? Yeah, exactly. And so that's another way to try to understand who you are, is to realize that you have habits and proclivities and ways of viewing the world, and then to get a sense of how get a sense of where you fall along that distribution. And of course, there's the assumption there that many of those habits and patterns of perception and attention are shared with other people, but just in different variations. And so everyone has the capacity to put themselves in a position that's uncomfortable, right? But then people, like I just said, people will vary in their willingness to do that, or how often they do that, or how how frequently they do that. And I think I mentioned this before. The personality framework that I personally think is the most valid and am also most familiar with is the Big Five personality paradigm, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you can think of those as a rough sketch of ways in which you contend with the world, and then ways that people vary along those dimensions. And so, just one quick example, everyone has a personality trait of openness, which you could think of as being associated with how intellectual you are, how engaged in aesthetic endeavors you are, how easily beauty captivates you, cap yeah, cap, captivates you, and you can take various tests that are reliable and valid, and you can figure out where you are along those dimensions according to, compared to tens of thousands of other people. And so some people might be in the 10th percentile in openness, and that means they really don't care about talking about ideas, and they really don't just care for aesthetically pleasing things. And then some people are in the 90th percentile, and they're just all over the map, and that's just a big part of who they are. And a lot of that is also biologically mediated, just in case anyone is wondering. So um, yeah, that was a rant.
I think it's interesting though, because when you described it, I think about like a video game when it has the five attributes and it's like in this circle, and each point is an attribute. And you think about like, you get about a good overall character. The good overall character fills up the circle. A bad overall character has little tangents that might go like somewhere this way, some that way. And it's like the scale of how well you've integrated this aspect into yourself. And we could argue over Well, what's the perfect balance? Well, the idea here isn't about being perfectly balanced to me. It's about understanding how to adjust those attributes for the situation that you're in. And this goes back to earlier where it's like being and becoming. Well, if I know I'm in this current state, I can look at my attributes. Well, in order for me to go where I want to go or where I'm becoming, if you can look at what you want to become, you could see what attributes you would need to practice in order to get there. And you could refine yourself into who you want it to be. But it requires you to be present to who you are and holistically willing to make the changes that it takes personality wise to get where you want to go. And so that's why the being becoming relationship is so interesting, and why Daoism is such an important thing, when the Wu Wei thing and how I really internalized it was, well, you have to sit still in order to make those changes. You know what I'm saying? Like, you have to really adjust yourself. You have to really pay attention to yourself. And you have to watch yourself and your habits and be accountable for where you aren't being who you say you want to become. That's the work. And your ability to do that consistently throughout a period of time until you've rearranged your habits. This is why 90-day, 60-day changes are good for people, because doing something for 90 days that's in alignment with the attribute that you need to train could adjust you right into the person you need to become. And then that door opens up for you. Well, how did I get this miracle? How did this synchronicity happen? Well, you were in position for it. Even when the Bible, they talk about the idea of being in position for God to bless you. Like, you hear a lot of Christians talk about that. This is what I believe that concept means in actuality. Have you adjusted your internal attributes to be in position for the situation and opportunity that you want to get you to that next level?
Absolutely. And two, I guess, practical forms or exemplars of what you're saying came to my mind. One is exposure therapy, and another is assertiveness training. It could be helpful. Let's pick assertiveness training. If you know that you are, let's say, agreeable, and so you're relatively compassionate and polite, and you don't like to cause conflict, and you don't like to stir things up, in some environments that's great, and in other environments that can be a hindrance. And so it can be helpful first to become aware of how agreeable you are, and then let's take someone who, say, is very agreeable, and they're trying to negotiate for themselves. They're trying to negotiate a raise at their job, but again, they don't want to cause a lot of conflict. Part of what assertiveness training does is, one, make you aware of all of these things that we're talking about, and then two, engages in various forms of practice over time. How to stand up for yourself, how to be exposed to the potential of social conflict, and how to learn to tolerate those things. And so, like you're saying, realizing where you're at, so let's say being, and then seeing where you could become, in the sense of, let's say you're in the 90th percentile in agreeableness. Like I mentioned before, a lot of this is genetically instantiated, and so you were born this way to a large degree, and so it'll be hard for you to try to, this is imprecise, but work your way down towards the 50th or 40th percentile in agreeableness. But it's a skill. It's something that you could practice, whereas some people would be the opposite, where they're really great at engaging in conflict. They actually thrive off of making people mad and pissing people off. They'll have to practice good manners. And so I definitely agree with you that it's useful to think of, again, yourself as being and becoming, where you first want to understand some framework to know who you are, and then to set goals associated with where you want to go. And again, people will vary in where they want to go, and that's another way of that's another indication of your personality. People, I don't know, we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but I was thinking about intelligence as well. It's another personality trait where I think, in keeping with what we've been discussing, one way to define intelligence could be how quickly you learn to master those habit environment patterns. So,
Mm-hmm.
and again, people vary in intelligence, and so that's these are all different dimensions that are helpful to think about as you're trying to understand yourself, and as you're trying to understand other people, for that matter.
Yep. And so one thing that I'm big on is I developed what I call the architecture of sovereignty. And really what it is just this it's like a practice. It's understanding that, okay, I believe that you're hermetically sealed. Some people argue that you are, some people argue that you aren't. I say that a lot. Hermetically sealed means you're sealed by, you have 7 seals. Everything is hermetically sealed. I believe the soul of anything is hidden behind a hermetic seal. And so that means you have 7 locks. Those 7 locks, I believe, are 7 self studies. So I have this thing on my website, dalpazaremporium.world, shameless plug. You can go on there and you can go through the 7 sciences that you believe explain yourself. I have 7 there. If you don't like those 7, go find your own. And then there's 7 expressions on the other side. So the first phase is to identify the soul self. How are you positioned in your body? You should understand how that works. And then once you understand how you're positioned, the next step is understanding how to express yourself. And that goes back to what you're saying, is that the being is knowing, okay, where am I at now? And then the becoming is, how do I best express that and where I want to go? And that's such an individual experience. I think sometimes we miss that because we've let biology explain to us who we are. But if you understand yourself biologically, but you don't understand yourself spiritually, you're missing at least 30-40% of the picture. You feel what I'm saying? And so, like, understanding that you're a biological being, you're a social being, you're a spiritual being, you're still part of the animal kingdom. How do you fit in the animal kingdom? What was your role before we created our own social hierarchies and our structures in this system? How do you fit in that mix? And then understanding, I believe the more that you understand yourself in different ways, the easier it is to unpack who you actually are and put that into play for you. And so when I come into certain situations and I have certain conversations with people, I'm like, how are you really, have you come up with a method for studying yourself? Like, you don't have to do what I do and have this intricate study, but how are you really going about understanding who you are? Because when you ask most people who they are, what do they give you? A name, an age, occupation. Those things don't encompass the entirety of who a person is. And I believe we overly attach to smaller parts of ourselves. And if we allowed ourselves to see the bigger picture, we wouldn't be so limited in how we interact with the world.
I agree. I agree completely. I do think there is a trade off that happens between, let's say, the psychological and the social. So let me share an experience to maybe hopefully illustrate what I'm saying. So when I was in the Marine Corps, I served 4 years as a logistics officer. When I told people what I was, or what I did, or who am I, when I tried to introduce myself, I said, I'm Solomon, I'm a Marine. And thankfully, in the social environments I was in, like I was never really out in other countries or engaging with someone who didn't know anything about the United States military, everyone immediately started making so many associations, right? Like the word
Mm-hmm.
Marine may, means slash meant so many things. So they thought, oh, discipline, fit, leader, strong, kills babies, whatever, right? Like for better or worse, they made different associations that were all packed into that label. And so there's a trade off there. It's like it's good because now I don't have to explain for 5 hours who I actually am, because that label covers a good bit. And to your point, it doesn't cover everything, but it's like it's enough to keep the social interactions going, right? Um, then when I got out of the Marine Corps and I started doing jobs that people knew less about, I realized, wow, this is actually kind of difficult. When I tell people what I do is or who I am, and I'm like, and then I just don't care anymore. I'm just like, okay, I don't care about this small social interaction anymore. Um, so that experience resonated with me when you brought up how we usually introduce ourselves and how we conceptualize ourselves.
And so let's get into it a level deeper. I don't think we understand how often the things that we associate ourselves with, how they give people the wrong perception of who we are. And I think that's something that I like to discuss often, is because it's like, okay, if you say, for instance, I say I'm from Atlanta in Uber, or to somebody that's not, like I'm not in Atlanta, I say I'm from Atlanta. Everybody's like, oh, it's a lot of gay people out there, huh? Bro, like how did we get into that situation? How is this the conversation now? You know what I'm saying? Or if I say I'm the bros, and in certain conversations, depending on the environment, that's two totally different conversations. Am I a professional and I respect it? Was I one of your was the bros one of your teachers, one of your coaches, one of your role models? Or did you walk into a cute dog party thinking that it was a regular party and somebody picked you up and now you're terrified? What's your perception of that? Am I a professional or am I a party person? That could be different depending on who understands what that means. And for instance, like I tell people I work IT, it's like, bro, the range on IT, bro, it's like, I can't even. I work for a school, and it's like the more I try to explain it, the less I get to even explaining anything about me, you know? And so it's about finding ways to identify yourself that are more true to yourself. And it's really just about the language. What language do you feel like best highlights the qualities that you want people to know about you? How could you begin to conversate in a way that allows people to see the version of you that you want to show and not the version of you that you feel trapped in? That's an important thing that I think a lot of people miss. Go ahead. I think you got something to say. I can see it in
Yeah.
your face.
No, no. Well, yes, but yes, absolutely. So much gets communicated unconsciously and implicitly compared to with the words themselves. And I just had an imaginary scenario where I am talking to someone, a stranger, let's say, or it's like at a gathering or something, and I'm trying to get to know this person, and they immediately, let's say, start talking about themselves. Oh God, I might get in a lot of trouble. Whatever, it's okay. Let's say they introduce themselves to me. They say their name, their pronouns, and their sexual orientation. I immediately make a cloud of associations. I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. Like this is this is what's happening here, and then I have to decide, how I want to do that based on my preferences and my values and the social context, and what all happens from there. And I think part of what I was just trying to highlight is people's willingness to conform socially. Let's say that's another
Mm.
level of personality itself that people vary, and where some people are just like, I don't give a fuck, I'm telling you like who I am, kind of like you mentioned before, like the distance between, I can't remember which selves you were, but in my language, the distance between the persona and ego is just so small to where what you
Mm-hmm.
see is what you get, and it's very genuine. And that's like, again, there's a time and a place for everything, but that was just a dimension of how people differ, and how people see themselves in other people that might be useful when trying to explore the self. How willing are you to conform to social norms, which I guess is another form of agreeableness. But that's why I like the Big Five so much, because I feel like it encompasses a good bit of at least how people describe themselves linguistically. There are obviously other ways to think about personality. People argue that, I'm not gonna get into that. That's a whole nerdy rant. But yeah, I just wanted to bring up that social conformity point.
Yeah, and I think it's important because when you talk about social conformity, for me, I have this understanding that all conversations are warfare. But you like to think you're talking with a friend or family, your perception is under attack constantly. Not only your perception, but your idea of self is under attack. And how often in conversations do people allow themselves to push back their actual self in order for sake of making the conversation easier? I think that's something that we have to talk about when we talk about the social, how to socially be yourself. Like, is there a limit on what you want to present to other people? There shouldn't be, I don't believe. I think you should be able to present yourself honestly in every space. But having the proper language to do that is very, very like you said, it takes a level of intelligence to really navigate that as you're going through it. Because how do you communicate with someone that has a preconceived notion about the way that you're describing yourself, and then now you have to work back from that? You know what I'm saying? Like you said, if somebody comes in and they introduce themselves with certain labels that you already know that your perception is opposite of, there's a tension that opens up there because you understand that I'm likely to say something to aggravate or upset this person. And whether or not you're okay with that and you're willing to have that conversation and do that song and dance is something that to me correlates to how well you actually trust yourself or how well you believe in yourself and um how firm your perception of self is and whether or not you're willing to move on that or whether or not you want to start beginning to enforce it. And I think that's another question is like I don't know if you ever heard of Zebra from Toriko. He was it's a whole thing, but he has this thing where it's like when you're in his space, this is my domain. So you act based off of who I believe myself to be, not who you believe me to be. I know who I am. This is who I am. And you're going to have to almost eradicate my perception or eradicate me in order to change how I move. And some people don't have that level of confidence. Some people is like, look, I'll be a rock if you need me to be a rock, as long as you leave me alone. You know what I'm saying? And so there's a range there on how well you stand on self and how hard you fight for self. And sometimes it's not necessary. I don't believe that a certain level of attachment to self is necessary. You should be able to, like, I know when I need to be big in a room, and I know when I need to kind of be like, you know what, I'm just watching. This ain't got nothing to do with me. I'm gonna mind my business. But in having that self awareness, I believe it's something else we could communicate about. It's like sometimes people feel like, well, I feel like nobody wants me here, this or that, and it's like, you're just not properly understanding your role in the space. You know, you're not really being aware of whether or not that's somewhere you even got business being at. For real, if we want to just be honest. Sometimes we want to be accepted in spaces that's just not for us. Or we're not being ourselves and we don't realize it, and that's why people aren't accepting us. Because like you said, most people notice us more than we know ourselves. And if you're out of character for who you truly are and you're just acting to try to fit in a space, that's why you're getting rejected. You're not being yourself. And people want to see you. Social media has proven to us that people want people that are going to be themselves. Castanet, I Show Speed are famous because they are themselves, as far as we know. And our ability to navigate that and be okay with that has either helped or hindered us in social media nowadays.
Man, social media is a great juxtaposition with trying to understand yourself, because who is anyway? It's hard enough to understand yourself without social media,
Mm.
and now we are bombarded with a lot of information, a lot of images about different cultures, about human nature, about the world, and we're constantly trying to separate ourselves from, let's say, external information. Like I mentioned, even without social media, it's so interesting to encounter people who, let's say, they're in their 30s and their their mind is essentially the voices of their parents. It's either their
I
father
know
or their
exactly what
mother
you're
or
talking
both of them, and it's not them when you talk to them. It's their
about. Hmm.
parents, and for better or worse, right? Or it's some ex that got a piece of them, or it's some, a sibling that, it's something, right? Like I mentioned at the beginning, we have various complexes that are like sub personalities. They are parts of us. They're spirits that can at times possess us, and sometimes they go underground, or they get projected out if you don't attend to them properly. And so it's hard enough without constantly getting bombarded with information that you don't even know its validity and its trueness. And so I there's a social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, who's done a lot of work on the impact of cell phones as technologies, as a form of technology, but also social media and the internet for adolescents, and what it's like to, and how it's impacting their development. And then he also makes a lot of prescriptions for parents. And so recommend his work for anyone who's interested in raising kids in the social media age. It's tough, man.
And I think it's important for us to realize that it's like social media is it's not a joke. Like you said, there's so many ideas that people are privy to. Like even if you just think about the amount of options that people can see now compared to what they seen back in the day. Like if you stayed in a small town, that small town was your life. There was nothing else. There was nowhere else for you to be. There was no one else for you to be. The occupations that were available in that job in that city were all you knew. If you wanted to do something else, you had to go to another city and find out about it. There wasn't that information availability. So what I think with social media though is that we comparison is the thief of joy. So if you watch somebody all the time and you're looking at all these other people that are living the life that you think you want to live, you begin to not value where you are presently. And so this is important with the idea of self, because with the being and becoming thing, if you're not willing to accept where you are currently, you can't drive anywhere else. Because when you look at who you are, if you've created this social media identity, well, I'm this, and you're trying to work from there, well, it's not going to work because you're not even working with what you actually have. You're not playing the cards that are actually in your hand. You're beginning to believe you're a lie, right? And so what I think about when I think about stuff like this is the concept of egregores. And egregore, to not make it too complicated, is idea of believing in something or having a thought that's so intense that it becomes personified. It's like taking your anger and making it an angel, like you said, a spirit or a being that now tells you, like, oh, well, my anger made me do it. Yeah, you created an egregore out of your anger. You personified your anger so much so that you no longer have control of yourself. You're possessed by the spirit of anger. Now we could argue whether or not there's a demon or something that's for anger and that's what gets a hold of you, or whether or not it's just the aspect of yourself that you've lost control of or that you've ignored for so long that it's beginning to control your subconscious mind just from lack of attentiveness. You're letting it run loose in your mind and you're not actively managing it, so you lose track of it. So a lot of times I think with social media we create a picture version of ourselves, like a mask, like people say. And that mask becomes how we try to navigate the society. And then when we step out in the real world and we talk to real people that aren't aware of that mask, we have a hard time communicating, especially in the youth. You see it all the time with these kids that are like, you talk to them, and the first thing they do is bring up, well, I'm this on social media, or I'm an influencer, and I do this, that, or the third. Okay, but in real life, what do you do? Like every day, not just when you post or when you have something to post. And if you post every day, cool. But have you really created a thing where you're authentic about your lifestyle, or are you fabricating most of it because you want to stay popular or you want to stay up with the trends? I think when we're moving forward, what we see with social media, you can see it now. Like there's a lot of depression. There's a lot of people that aren't happy with themselves, don't view themselves a certain way because they're viewing themselves from the lens of social media and letting that determine their relevance instead of actually looking at the value that they bring to real people and real lives around them on a day to day.
Absolutely. There's another American psychologist named Carl Rogers who thought of the psyche in terms of, put it like this. He thought that one of the major sources of psychological distress, let's call it anxiety, came from an inauthenticity, incongruity. That's a better word. An incongruence. And so this is how he framed it. You're navigating the world and you have these experiences, and those experiences eventually trigger, for lack of a better term, emotions. And from those emotions, you have thoughts, and then you can communicate those thoughts to other people. And he would say that to the degree that there is a separation or a disjointing between these different levels, you are psychologically vulnerable. You're vulnerable to anxiety and distress because I, I guess because there's a lack of solidity there. There's more entropy perhaps in the system. There's a lack of organization and stability there. And one of the things that he would do in therapy a lot is embody authenticity essentially in himself to try to get his clients to imitate that and to learn that, if his client said something weird or disturbing, oftentimes he would say, so you just said X, Y, and Z. That made me feel a little disgusted or disturbed or something. Could you help me explore maybe why I perceived you as that? And so he would be very genuine in his reactions, but through talking it out with the other person, hopefully, uh, so the theory went, the client would learn to do that for themselves as well. And so, yeah, social media to, in many senses, just amplifies, I guess, the amount of incongruity incongruence that we can have.
Yeah, and I think like going back to the architecture of sovereignty is a reason. Like when you get into how I built it, it's almost like a house. There's a foundation, and then there's three pillars on top. Like so, there's a house, and then there's a roof. Like understanding that physically you are one thing, and spiritually you are another. There's a space in between there, and if you overly lean into the spiritual side of it, there's a result of what they call spiritual bypassing, where it's like, okay, so you have completely removed yourself from physical reality. And so you're living off of a set of rules that don't matter in physical reality. So you're thinking about the world in a way that's incongruent with your actual environment, in short. And so the idea here is that thinking about ways to build an idea of self that are holistic is the word that I use, but it's like, are you really taking account of everything there? Because, like you said, the bigger the gaps are there, the more somebody can come in and say something that destroys your perception of self. Think of it like a house of cards or a building. If you don't build the foundation strong enough, then you're constantly rebuilding. Like I said in the last video, the other video where we're talking about the idea of your ego being destroyed, is like, okay, well, is it really something that, like, to me, the idea of awakening is coming together with an idea or perception of self that can be destroyed in the physical reality. It's something that is actually true beyond this level. Like it's not something that this level can disturb or create disharmony in. And so the physical self is rooted in the spiritual self to me, like, or the soul seat. And that perception of that soul seat is in our ability to align and build a structure around it that lets the light shine through the house, if that makes sense. Like if you create the right idea of if you holistically bring in all the aspects of self, it amplifies the soul self to speak through the physical vessel. This is the whole enlightenment, the sun behind the head of the enlightened individuals, is that they've allowed their soul to shine outside of their physical body by embracing the truest nature of self. And so anytime that you embrace part of that, it dims the light on who you actually are. And that's the little song and dance that we talk about when we talk about the idea of self and being the best version of self, and just really figuring out how to best, like you said, even through conversation. Like one thing I do when I do like intuitive consultations or healing sessions, like I don't consider myself a shaman or a therapist, but if you sit and talk to me long enough, the same way you're talking about with the psychiatrist, is like, I'm just going to question why you limit yourself in certain ways, in a way that almost lets you begin to think about it. When you go out and you leave talking to me, when you go to do the things that you normally do, you're not questioning it, like, this doesn't make sense. I probably should try something else. And that adjustment and that idea to inspire questions, I believe, is what continues the person to grow.
You you reminded me of something that Freud would likely talk about. So Freud thought of the psyche as being consisting of the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is the unconscious part where all of your, let's say, biological drives and instincts and impulses are. And then you have your ego, like we've been talking about. And then the superego is essentially your conscious. It's the voice of reason, for lack of better terms. It's the internalized representation of social expectations and morality. And
Jiminy
one,
Cricket.
it's Jiminy Cricket. It's JC. It's Jesus Christ. It's it's
Yep.
it's and so many orthodox psychoanalysts will frame what they do to some clients in terms of, let's say, strengthening their superego. And many clients have reported that their therapist's voice becomes their superego. And so as they're navigating the world and they come up on problems, or they are about to do something that they shouldn't do, or they stop doing something that they should keep doing, it's the therapist's voice often that starts talking to them, and it's like, are you sure about that? Have you considered this? Which is really funny. So that just what you reminded me of in terms of your spiritual consultations, which I think is, it's great, man. Dialogue is so powerful, and I think there's a reason that many, if not most people, think in words. It's an internal dialogue, and that's why we prefer, for the most part, conversations with other people, because a genuine dialogue is an outsourcing of thinking, where you can get the same thing done, but now instead of you trying to have two voices in your mind discussing a problem, you can dedicate yourself to one side of the conversation and then someone else does the same thing, and now you could just get so much further. And so another way to figure out who you are. And man, I'm really free associating today. I think it's crazy. But I was just also thinking about the importance of having an intimate partner who really, particularly from my perspective, marriage, someone who lives with you, someone who sees you through everything and sees your bullshit. Because
Definitely.
if you're someone who's like, man, I work so hard and I'm always committed and I do this, but your partner sees everything.
You in the
Like
bed
you
with the
can't you it's
Cheetos.
you can't lie to them. You can't lie. In some sense, they force you to, like you mentioned before, face those aspects of your being that you just haven't attended to before, and then you have to decide what you're gonna do with that. But it's so useful to have a partner that will hold up a mirror to you. But then obviously you have to be willing to look. So
Definitely. I think that's a big thing, bro. Like I could not explain how instrumental my lady has been in me making certain growths over the last couple of years, bro. Because it's just certain things that she'll just call me out on, and I'll be about to say, and I just really sit and think on it. And I'm like, you know what, bro? You right. I I'm gonna tighten up. I'm gonna get right because it's just like you have to really be accountable, like you said, and having somebody that can see you for who you are and can correct you when you're off path, and especially somebody that you explain what your goals are to, and that's willing to keep you accountable for how you're going to get there and the things that it takes to get there is instrumental. I think sometimes it's also why a lot of relationships fail though, because they're not willing to make those changes and see themselves for who they are, and they end up blaming their partner for, oh, well, you don't really like me. No, I just really want to see you grow. And I'm not going to allow myself to not be a part of that. Like if either you're going to grow or I'm going to push you away because I really want to see that. And I think it's interesting when we have those kind of conversations about what it takes to grow and what that looks like. Even with some people bringing in AI now into the conversation of how people are able to have those conversations and then have someone that's intellectual enough to actually feel that other side of the conversation perfectly. AI does a great job of that, especially if you give it the lens that you need. Like, hey, I need you to be this type of person so I can have this conversation so I can get a better understanding. You know, a lot of times, like with my theories, I'm so much more confident in the information I'm bringing forward because of that, because I'm able to be like, hey, does this make sense? And I don't have to like embarrass myself to do it. I don't have to have an intervention because I asked a crazy question. No, I can just get information. Okay, cool. That gives me a little bit of confirmation. And then now I can go and have that conversation with more clarity with people in real time. And I think that's an important thing. Um, as we kind of getting closer to time here, what do you think else we want to bring up before we cut off this episode today, man? I think we've done a great job of really discussing the entirety of self and the different tools that you can use to kind of dig into that. It's really just there's so many different ways and so many different things that get you into self, and I think that's what makes self work such a good thing. Is like there's no one way to do this, but you should definitely be doing it.
yeah, no, absolutely. We covered many different frameworks, the big five: intelligence, social conformity, your seven sciences. Is that how you? Is that what you called it? Um, if I had to extract out a few principles or ideas though that I felt like were key, one is definitely being and becoming. Like you are who you are now, yes, but you are also who you could become, for better or worse. You are actuality and potential, and that's something that has been very helpful in my life, at least as I made it more explicit in my relationship, at work, in my relationship to myself. Just understanding that people change and people can change, but it's more than that. There is a realm of your being that's not yet awakened, and you can awaken. Like that's so cool. I don't know. For me, that's so optimistic. It can also be pessimistic because there's not your potential isn't only good, and so you're you have to be mindful of that. Like you can drift off into your shadow, for lack of better terms, or you can integrate more of your parts, so that way you can be more holistic, to use your word uh, earlier. And so the idea of being becoming, for me, has been very crucial. It's very similar to order and chaos, which is again a running theme through everything we've been discussing. And I guess the second thing I would say is that the first step just comes with awareness, reading, listening to other people, watching yourself, developing the ability to watch yourself. One of the things I do is I have a habit tracker. I have 7 habits that I try to do every single day, and I have an Excel sheet, and so I can look back across the years and see how effective I am at trying to commit to these goals. And then I also ask myself, well, why do I have those goals in the first place? And so being and becoming, having that awareness and developing that awareness of who you are and who you can be. And then I guess the last thing that I would say is just asking the right questions. With AI now, with all the different resources available to us, again, for better or worse, learning how to ask the right questions can really get you a long way.
Facts. I do think a lot of it is in the questions and how you ask them. I'll leave it with this. When we talk about being and becoming, first of all, we're talking about a dualistic system, right? So the easier, the best way to understand something is to break it into its smallest parts. Well, we know that in the unity, it's hard for us to see the entirety of what we are. But if we can break it into two things in any way, it makes it easier for us to perceive ourselves. And I like being and becoming because it teaches you how to manifest. If you know where you're at and you know where you want to go, you can plot a path and you can visualize that path. You can set an intention for that path and the changes that you need to make and the habits you need to make to get there. So don't let self work be something you're scared of. Like you said, ask the right questions, find the path for you, and then make sure that you believe it before you try to leave and try to do something else. Don't let yourself start on that path. Don't leave. Don't start taking actions until the stillness has given you an answer that you truly believe in is you and that you're okay with. And then if you ever don't feel like that's you anymore, sit back down and reassess. Sometimes I believe we sit too long with a version of ourselves that we outgrown and we haven't assessed it again. And so continue to work on those habits, continue to refine yourself. And I think one thing, dog, that I feel like as far as another topic would be is really getting into um, that social aspect of it. I believe is how do we really find better ways to interact socially, and how do you not allow social pressures to define who you are as a person, especially with social media, especially with the world the way that it is. There's a lot of pressure for you to conform to what everybody else thinks, and like you said, agree with the way that other people perceive things. And sometimes that robs you from your power of being yourself and choosing and making your own decisions. Don't let the world decide everything for you. You know, it doesn't because then you don't because then what are you contributing? How are you refining the space that we live in at all? And how are you adding to the mix that is this melting pot that we're in?
Absolutely. I love it, man. Next talk, how to navigate the social reality.
It's gonna be an interesting one.
Sounds
I
good.
appreciate y'all for coming out. If you watched everything, man, and Solo, always a pleasure having a conversation, dog. We're gonna start promoting the lives probably next week. I just wanted to make sure I was gonna stay consistent with it for a little while before I put out a flyer. But yeah,
Sounds
we're
good.
here, dog. Enjoyed it.
All right, man. Later.
All right, boss.